The scorching Texas sun beat down mercilessly on the dusty town of Cedar Ridge in 1885, where 19-year-old Elizabeth Morrison had spent her entire life under the iron fist of her father, Jeremiah Morrison. The Morrison family owned the largest general store in town, and Jeremiah wielded his influence like a weapon, believing that his word was law not just in business, but in every aspect of his family's lives. Elizabeth had always been different from the other young women in Cedar Ridge. While they focused on needlework and preparing for marriage, she spent her time reading every book she could get her hands on, helping customers with complex orders, and even keeping the store's books when her father wasn't looking. Her mind was sharp, her spirit fierce, and her determination to live life on her own terms unwavering. The trouble began when Marcus Blackwood, the son of a wealthy cattle baron from the neighboring county, set his sights on Elizabeth during a town social gathering. Marcus was everything Elizabeth despised in a man: arrogant, entitled, and used to getting whatever he wanted through his family's money and influence. He was also nearly 15 years her senior, with a reputation for drinking heavily and treating women poorly. When Marcus approached Jeremiah with a marriage proposal, offering a substantial dowry that would significantly expand the Morrison family's business interests, Elizabeth's father saw dollar signs rather than his daughter's happiness. The arrangement was made without consulting Elizabeth, as was customary in their community, but Jeremiah severely underestimated his daughter's resolve. "I will not marry that man," Elizabeth declared when her father informed her of the engagement over dinner that evening. Her mother, Ruth, sat silently at the table, her eyes downcast as she had learned to do whenever her husband made proclamations about their family's future. Jeremiah's face darkened with anger. "You will do as you are told, Elizabeth. This marriage will secure our family's future and elevate our standing in this community. Marcus Blackwood is a good match, and you should be grateful for his interest." Grateful? Elizabeth's voice rose with indignation. "Father, I've seen how he treats the women who work in his family's household. I've heard the stories about his drinking and his temper. I would rather remain unmarried for the rest of my life than bind myself to such a man." The argument continued late into the evening, with Jeremiah growing increasingly frustrated by his daughter's defiance. He had expected some resistance, but nothing like this outright rebellion. In his world, daughters obeyed their fathers without question, and wives obeyed their husbands the same way. Elizabeth's independence threatened everything he believed about the natural order of things. Meanwhile, unbeknownst to the Morrison family, their heated argument was being overheard by someone who would soon play a crucial role in Elizabeth's fate. James Crawford, a rancher who owned a modest spread on the outskirts of town, had stopped by the general store late that evening to purchase supplies for an early morning cattle drive. The store was closed, but he could hear the raised voices coming from the family's living quarters above the shop. James was a quiet man in his late 20s who had built his ranch from nothing through hard work and determination. Unlike many of the other men in Cedar Ridge, he treated everyone with respect regardless of their station in life, and he had always admired Elizabeth's intelligence and independence from afar. He had never felt worthy of approaching someone as refined and educated as the store owner's daughter, but hearing her passionate defense of her right to choose her own path stirred something deep within him. As the days passed, the tension in the Morrison household reached a breaking point. Elizabeth continued to refuse the marriage, despite increasingly harsh punishments from her father. He restricted her movements, forbade her from reading, and eventually banned her from working in the store altogether. But Elizabeth's spirit remained unbroken. Marcus Blackwood, growing impatient with the delay, began pressuring Jeremiah to control his daughter more effectively. He had already made arrangements for the wedding and had no intention of being embarrassed by a defiant bride. His own reputation was at stake, and he made it clear that he expected Jeremiah to deliver Elizabeth to the altar, willing or not. The breaking point came on a sweltering Thursday afternoon when Elizabeth made one final, desperate attempt to reason with her father. She had spent hours preparing her arguments, hoping to appeal to whatever paternal love might still exist beneath his rigid expectations. "Father, please listen to me," she pleaded as he worked behind the store counter. "I understand that you want what's best for our family, but forcing me into this marriage will destroy any chance I have for happiness. Surely my well-being matters more than business arrangements." Jeremiah slammed his ledger shut and fixed her with a cold stare. "Your happiness is not my concern, Elizabeth. Your duty to this family is. You have brought nothing but shame upon us with your defiance, and it ends today." "I cannot marry Marcus Blackwood," Elizabeth said firmly. "I will not." That evening, Jeremiah made a decision that would forever change the relationship between father and daughter. He sent word to Marcus that the wedding would proceed as planned in 3 days' time, and that Elizabeth would be a compliant bride. To ensure this outcome, he decided to employ a method of persuasion that was both legal and socially acceptable in their time and place: corporal punishment administered by a father to discipline a disobedient child. The next morning, Jeremiah summoned Elizabeth to the barn behind their property, where he intended to break her spirit once and for all. He had fashioned a makeshift whipping post and procured a leather strap that he believed would convince his daughter to see reason. Ruth Morrison watched from the kitchen window, her heart breaking for her daughter but too frightened of her husband's wrath to intervene. Unknown to any of them, James Crawford had been passing by on his way to check on some stray cattle when he noticed the unusual activity around the Morrison property. Something about the situation troubled him, and he positioned himself where he could observe without being seen, his instincts telling him that Elizabeth might be in danger. Elizabeth stood before her father with her chin raised and her back straight, refusing to show the fear that coursed through her veins. She had heard whispered stories of other young women who had been corrected in similar ways, and she knew what was coming. But even faced with physical punishment, she could not bring herself to agree to a marriage that would destroy her soul. "This is your last chance, Elizabeth," Jeremiah said as he tested the weight of the leather strap in his hands. "Agree to marry Marcus Blackwood willingly, and we can put this unpleasantness behind us." Elizabeth looked her father directly in the eyes and spoke with quiet dignity. "I will not marry him, father. No amount of punishment will change my mind." Jeremiah's face contorted with rage and frustration. His authority had been challenged in the most public way possible, and he felt that his reputation as the head of his household hung in the balance. Without another word, he ordered Elizabeth to place her hands against the wooden post and began the brutal task of trying to beat his daughter into submission. The first blow landed across Elizabeth's shoulders with a sickening crack that echoed across the barnyard. She bit her lip to keep from crying out, determined not to give her father the satisfaction of seeing her break. The second blow was harder, leaving a burning stripe of pain across her back. Still, she refused to speak. From his hiding place, James Crawford watched in horror as the beating continued. His hands clenched into fists as he struggled with the decision of whether to intervene. He knew that technically, Jeremiah had the legal right to discipline his daughter as he saw fit, but everything in James's moral code rebelled against what he was witnessing. As the punishment continued, Elizabeth's resolve began to waver not because of the pain, but because of the devastating realization that the man she had loved and respected as her father was capable of such cruelty. Tears streamed down her face, but they were tears of grief for the relationship that was being destroyed with each blow, not tears of surrender. By the 10th blow, Elizabeth's dress was torn and bloodied, and she was struggling to remain standing. Her father's arm was growing tired, but his determination to break her will remain strong. He paused to catch his breath and made one final demand. "Will you marry Marcus Blackwood?" he asked, his voice hoarse from exertion. Elizabeth turned her head just enough to look at him over her shoulder, her eyes blazing with defiance despite her physical condition. "I will not," she whispered, her voice barely audible but her conviction unmistakable. Jeremiah raised the strap for what he intended to be the final, most devastating blow, one that would either break his daughter's spirit completely or potentially cause serious injury. It was at this crucial moment that James Crawford made the decision that would change all of their lives forever. As Jeremiah's arm began its downward arc, James burst from his hiding place and sprinted across the barnyard, his boots pounding against the hard-packed earth. He reached the scene just as the strap was beginning its descent and caught Jeremiah's wrist in an iron grip, stopping the blow mere inches from Elizabeth's battered back. "That's enough," James said in a voice that was quiet but carried unmistakable authority. His eyes met Jeremiah's with a steely determination that made the older man step back involuntarily. The confrontation that followed would become the stuff of legend in Cedar Ridge, marking the beginning of a battle that would expose the true character of everyone involved and ultimately lead to a reckoning that none of them could have anticipated. James Crawford stood between Elizabeth and her father like an immovable force of nature, his weathered hands still gripping Jeremiah's wrist with surprising strength. The leather strap fell to the dusty ground as the two men faced each other in a moment that seemed to stretch on forever. "You have no right to interfere in my family's affairs," Jeremiah snarled, trying to wrench his arm free from James's grasp. His face was flushed with rage and embarrassment at being challenged by someone he considered beneath his social station. "And you have no right to treat another human being like this," James replied evenly, finally releasing Jeremiah's wrist but positioning himself protectively in front of Elizabeth. "What I just witnessed wasn't discipline, it was torture." Elizabeth, who had been prepared for another devastating blow, found herself trembling with a mixture of relief and shock. She had never expected rescue to come from James Crawford, the quiet rancher who had always seemed to fade into the background during their brief interactions at the store. Yet here he was, risking his own standing in the community to defend her. Jeremiah retrieved the fallen strap and pointed it accusingly at James. "This is none of your concern, Crawford. Elizabeth is my daughter, and I'll raise her as I see fit. The law gives me that right." "The law might give you that right," James acknowledged, his voice remaining calm despite the tension crackling in the air between them. "But that doesn't make it morally defensible. Look at her, Morrison. Really look at what you've done to your own child." For the first time since the beating began, Jeremiah actually looked at Elizabeth, really looked at her. What he saw should have filled any father with shame and remorse. Her dress was torn and stained with blood, her face was streaked with tears and dirt, and her entire body shook with exhaustion and trauma. But instead of feeling paternal concern, Jeremiah felt only frustrated anger that his authority had been undermined. "She brought this upon herself with her defiance," he said defensively. "All she has to do is agree to marry Marcus Blackwood, and this unpleasantness will be over." James turned to look at Elizabeth, seeing her clearly for perhaps the first time. Her dark hair had come loose from its pins and hung in tangled waves around her shoulders. Her green eyes, though filled with pain, still blazed with the same fierce intelligence and determination that had always set her apart from other young women in town. Despite everything she had endured, her spirit remained unbroken. "Is that what you want?" James asked her gently. "Do you want to marry Marcus Blackwood?" Elizabeth straightened her shoulders as much as her injuries would allow and met his gaze directly. "I would rather die than marry that man," she said with absolute conviction. James nodded, having heard all he needed to hear. He turned back to Jeremiah with renewed determination. "Then this ends here and now. You will not lay another hand on her. Who do you think you are to make demands of me?" Jeremiah's voice rose to a near shout. "You're nothing but a dirt farmer with delusions of grandeur. Elizabeth is promised to Marcus Blackwood, and she will fulfill that promise whether she likes it or not. I'm someone who believes that every person has the right to choose their own path in life," James replied. "And I'm someone who won't stand by and watch you destroy your daughter's spirit in service of your greed." The accusation of greed hit its mark, and Jeremiah's face turned an even deeper shade of red. "How dare you question my motives? This marriage will provide security for Elizabeth's future. She's too naive to understand what's best for her. She seems plenty intelligent enough to recognize a bad situation when she sees one," James countered. "Maybe you should trust her judgment instead of trying to beat it out of her." Ruth Morrison, who had been watching the confrontation from the kitchen window, finally found the courage to venture outside. She approached the group hesitantly, her hands wringing the apron tied around her waist. "Jeremiah," she said softly, "perhaps we should discuss this matter inside, away from prying eyes." Her husband whirled on her with the same fury he had directed at James. "You will return to the house immediately, Ruth. This doesn't concern you." "My daughter's welfare concerns me very much," Ruth replied, surprising everyone including herself with the firmness in her voice. It was perhaps the first time in years that she had openly contradicted her husband. James watched this family drama unfold with growing understanding of the dynamics at play. It wasn't just Elizabeth who was trapped by Jeremiah's tyrannical control. His wife lived under the same oppressive thumb. The man claimed to be protecting and providing for his family, but in reality, he was destroying them piece by piece. "Mrs. Morrison is right," James said, addressing Ruth directly. "This is a family matter, and it should be discussed calmly and rationally. But it should also be discussed with Elizabeth's voice being heard and respected." Jeremiah looked between his wife, his daughter, and this upstart rancher who had dared to challenge his authority, and realized that he was losing control of the situation entirely. His carefully constructed world, where his word was law and his family obeyed without question, was crumbling before his eyes. "Fine," he said through gritted teeth. "We'll discuss this inside. But understand this, Crawford. You've overstepped your bounds here today, and there will be consequences for your interference. James met the threat with calm resolve. I'm willing to face whatever consequences come from doing what's right. As the group prepared to move toward the house, Elizabeth swayed slightly on her feet, the adrenaline that had sustained her during the confrontation beginning to fade. James immediately moved to her side, offering his arm for support. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice hoarse from crying and exertion. "I don't know why you helped me, but I'm grateful." James looked down at her battered face and felt something shift in his chest, a protective instinct so strong it surprised him with its intensity. "Everyone deserves to have someone stand up for them," he said quietly. "And you deserve so much better than what's been done to you today." Their eyes met for a moment that seemed to exist outside of time, and Elizabeth saw something in James Crawford's gaze that she had never seen in Marcus Blackwood's: genuine respect and care for her as a person, not as a piece of property to be acquired. The walk to the house was slow and painful for Elizabeth, but James remained beside her every step of the way, his presence somehow making the ordeal bearable. Jeremiah stalked ahead of them, his jaw set in a hard line as he tried to figure out how to regain control of the situation. Ruth held the door open for them, her eyes filled with tears as she got her first close look at her daughter's injuries. "Oh, Elizabeth," she breathed, reaching out as if to touch her daughter's face before pulling her hand back. "I'll be all right, Mama," Elizabeth assured her, though they both knew that the damage went far deeper than the physical wounds. Once they were all gathered in the Morrison family's modest parlor, an uncomfortable silence settled over the room. Jeremiah sat rigidly in his favorite chair, clearly struggling to maintain his composure in front of an outsider. Ruth perched nervously on the edge of the settee, while Elizabeth lowered herself carefully into a nearby chair, wincing as the fabric touched her injured back. James remained standing, his hat in his hands but his posture alert and ready for whatever might come next. He had crossed a line by interfering in another man's family affairs, and he knew that the consequences would likely extend far beyond this single confrontation. "Now then," Jeremiah began, his voice artificially calm, "I think it's time for you to explain exactly what gives you the right to involve yourself in matters that don't concern you, Crawford." James considered his words carefully before responding. "I suppose I don't have any legal right to be here," he admitted, "but I have a moral obligation to stand up against injustice when I see it, regardless of who's perpetrating it." "Injustice." Jeremiah's carefully maintained composure cracked slightly. "I am trying to secure my daughter's future through an advantageous marriage. That's not injustice. That's responsible parenting." "Beating someone into submission isn't responsible parenting," James replied firmly. It's abuse, plain and simple. And forcing someone into marriage against their will isn't securing their future, it's destroying it. Elizabeth watched this exchange with fascination and growing hope. She had never heard anyone speak to her father with such direct challenge to his authority, and she was amazed by James's quiet courage in the face of obvious social and potentially legal consequences. You seem to have strong opinions about marriage for a man who's never taken a wife, Jeremiah said, his voice dripping with contempt. Perhaps if you understood the responsibilities that come with providing for a family, you'd see things differently. James didn't rise to the bait. I understand responsibility just fine. I also understand that true responsibility means protecting the people you care about, not using them as bargaining chips in business deals. The accusation hung in the air like a physical presence, and even Ruth drew in a sharp breath at the boldness of it. But James wasn't finished. Elizabeth is an intelligent, capable young woman who deserves the chance to choose her own path in life, he continued. If you truly care about her future, you'll respect her enough to listen to what she wants instead of trying to force her into a situation that will make her miserable. And what exactly do you think she wants? Jeremiah demanded. To remain a spinster for the rest of her life, to work in my store until she's old and gray. What kind of future is that for any woman? For the first time since entering the house, Elizabeth spoke up. I want the chance to decide for myself what kind of future I'll have, she said, her voice growing stronger with each word. Maybe I will choose to marry someday, but it will be to someone I respect and care for, not to someone who sees me as nothing more than property to be acquired. Respect and care don't put food on the table or a roof over your head, Jeremiah shot back. Marcus Blackwood can provide for you in ways that your romantic notions never could. I'd rather live in poverty with my dignity intact than in luxury as someone's prisoner, Elizabeth replied, surprising herself with her own boldness. James felt a surge of admiration for her courage. Even after everything she had endured, she was still fighting for her right to self-determination. It was in that moment that he made a decision that would change both of their lives forever. What if she didn't have to choose between dignity and security? He said quietly. All eyes turned to him, and James felt his heart begin to race as he prepared to take the biggest gamble of his life. He looked directly at Elizabeth, seeing the question in her eyes, and decided to trust in the connection he felt between them. The third phase of this confrontation was about to begin, and none of them could have predicted the path it would take. What exactly are you suggesting? Jeremiah asked, his voice heavy with suspicion as he studied James's face for any sign of deception or ulterior motive. James took a deep breath, knowing that his next words would irrevocably change the course of his life and Elizabeth's. He had never been one for grand gestures or bold declarations, but something about watching Elizabeth's courage in the face of impossible odds had awakened a boldness in him that he never knew existed. I'm suggesting that Elizabeth doesn't have to choose between an unwanted marriage and spinsterhood, James said, his voice steady despite the magnitude of what he was about to propose. I'm suggesting that there might be a third option. Elizabeth felt her heart begin to race as she sensed what was coming. She had barely exchanged more than polite pleasantries with James Crawford over the years, yet here he was, quite literally putting himself between her and harm's way. The quiet rancher who had always seemed content to fade into the background was revealing depths of character that she had never suspected. "Speak plainly, Crawford," Jeremiah demanded, though something in his tone suggested he already suspected what James was building toward. James turned to face Elizabeth directly, his blue eyes meeting her green ones with an intensity that made her breath catch. "Miss Morrison," he said formally, "I know this isn't the most romantic of circumstances, and I know we barely know each other beyond passing acquaintances. But I've watched you from afar for years, and I've always admired your intelligence, your kindness, and your strength of character." Ruth gasped softly, her hand flying to her throat as she realized what was happening. Even Jeremiah fell silent, too shocked by this unexpected turn of events to immediately respond. "I'm not a wealthy man like Marcus Blackwood," James continued, his voice growing more confident as he spoke from his heart. "I can't offer you luxury or social status, but I can offer you something he never could: respect, partnership, and the freedom to be exactly who you are. If you'll have me, I'd be honored to call you my wife." Elizabeth stared at him in amazement, struggling to process what she had just heard. In the span of a single afternoon, she had gone from facing a brutal beating and forced marriage to receiving a proposal from a man who was offering her everything she had ever dreamed of: choice, respect, and genuine partnership. "You can't be serious," Jeremiah sputtered, finally finding his voice. "You think you can waltz in here and steal my daughter away? She's promised to Marcus Blackwood, and that arrangement stands." "With respect, sir," James replied, never taking his eyes off Elizabeth, "the only person who can make that decision is Elizabeth herself. I'm simply offering her an alternative." Elizabeth's mind raced as she considered the implications of what James was proposing. She barely knew him, yet everything she had observed about his character suggested that he was a man of honor and integrity. The way he had risked his own standing in the community to defend her spoke volumes about his moral courage. And the respect he was showing her now, asking for her choice rather than demanding her compliance, was unlike anything she had ever experienced. She began, then stopped, overwhelmed by the magnitude of the moment. "Mr. Crawford, I'm honored by your proposal, but I hardly know you. How can you be certain that you want to bind yourself to someone you've barely spoken to?" James smiled at her practical question, appreciating that even in this extraordinary situation, her logical mind was working clearly. "You're right that we haven't had many conversations," he acknowledged. "But I've had plenty of opportunities to observe your character. I've seen how you treat everyone who comes into your father's store with equal kindness, regardless of their station in life. I've watched you slip extra supplies to families struggling to make ends meet when you thought no one was looking. I've seen you stand up for what's right even when it costs you personally." Elizabeth felt tears prick her eyes, but they were tears of wonder rather than pain. She had never realized that anyone had been paying such close attention to her actions, or that someone had seen value in the small kindnesses she tried to show others. "More than that," James continued, "I've seen your strength and courage today. You were willing to endure terrible punishment rather than compromise your principles. That tells me everything I need to know about the kind of person you are." "This is ridiculous," Jeremiah interjected angrily. "Elizabeth, you will not even consider this absurd proposal. Your promise to Marcus Blackwood, and that's final." For the first time since James had made his proposal, Elizabeth looked away from him to face her father. What she saw there was a man consumed by pride and greed, someone who had lost sight of what truly mattered in his determination to maintain control and social status. "Father," she said quietly, "you've made it clear that my happiness and well-being mean nothing to you. You're willing to force me into marriage with a man I despise and to beat me when I resist. Why should I honor any promise you made on my behalf without my consent?" Jeremiah's face grew purple with rage. "Because I am your father, and you owe me obedience and respect." "Respect is earned, not demanded," Elizabeth replied, her voice growing stronger. "And a father who truly loves his daughter wouldn't sell her to the highest bidder." Ruth, who had been silent throughout this exchange, suddenly spoke up. "Jeremiah," she said softly, "look at what we've become. Look at what you've done to our family." Her husband turned on her with fury. "Don't you dare take her side against me, Ruth. I am the head of this household, and my decisions are final. Your decisions have driven our daughter to the point where she'd rather accept a proposal from a near stranger than submit to your will," Ruth replied, showing more backbone than she had displayed in years. "Doesn't that tell you something about the choices you've been making?" James watched this family confrontation with a heavy heart, realizing that his proposal had exposed fractures in the Morrison family that went far deeper than just the disagreement over Elizabeth's marriage. But he also recognized that Elizabeth needed to make her own choice, free from pressure from any source, including him. "Elizabeth," he said gently, drawing her attention back to him, I don't want you to feel like you have to choose me simply to escape an unwanted situation. If you'd prefer, I can help you find another way out of this predicament. Perhaps relatives in another town who would take you in, or other options we haven't considered yet. Elizabeth studied his face, seeing the sincerity in his offer. He was genuinely willing to help her without expecting anything in return, which only reinforced her growing belief that he was a man of true honor. "And if I were to consider your proposal," she asked carefully, "what exactly would you expect from me as your wife?" James appreciated her directness and answered with equal honesty. "I'd expect you to be my partner in all things," he said. "I run a cattle ranch, and it's hard work that requires both physical labor and business acumen. I'd welcome your help with the books, the planning, and any other aspects of the operation where your skills could contribute. Beyond that, I'd hope that we could build a life together based on mutual respect and, eventually, genuine affection. And you wouldn't expect me to simply be decorative and submissive." Elizabeth pressed, needing to be absolutely clear about what she would be agreeing to. James actually chuckled at that. "Miss Morrison, after what I've witnessed today, I think it would be impossible for you to be submissive even if you tried. And honestly, I wouldn't want you to be. The world has enough decorative women who are afraid to speak their minds. What it needs is more women like you, intelligent, principled, and brave enough to stand up for what's right." Elizabeth felt something shift in her chest as she listened to his words. For the first time in her life, someone was not only accepting her independent spirit, but actually celebrating it. The contrast between James's attitude and Marcus Blackwood's expectation that she would be a silent, obedient ornament could not have been more stark. "There's something else you should know," James continued, his voice taking on a more serious tone. "If you agree to marry me, your father will likely disown you. Marcus Blackwood will certainly see it as an insult to his pride, and his family has enough influence to make life difficult for us. We'd be starting our life together with very few allies and quite a few enemies." "Are you trying to talk me out of accepting your proposal?" Elizabeth asked with a slight smile, appreciating his honesty about the challenges they would face. "I'm trying to make sure you understand exactly what you'd be getting into," James replied. "I won't lie to you or hide the difficulties we'd face. You deserve to make this decision with full knowledge of the consequences." Elizabeth looked around the parlor that had been her home for 19 years, taking in her father's furious face, her mother's worried expression, and the general atmosphere of tension and unhappiness that had pervaded the house for as long as she could remember. Then she looked back at James Crawford, seeing in his steady gaze the promise of a completely different kind of life, one where she would be valued for who she was rather than punished for it. "Mr. Crawford," she said formally, "I accept your proposal." The silence that followed her words was deafening. Jeremiah looked as though he had been struck by lightning. Ruth began to weep quietly into her handkerchief, and James felt a surge of joy mixed with terror at the magnitude of what had just been decided. "Elizabeth, no," Jeremiah said, his voice cracking with desperation. "You don't know what you're doing. You're throwing away everything I've worked to build for this family." Elizabeth stood up slowly, wincing as her injuries protested the movement, but holding her head high with dignity. "I'm choosing to build something better," she said firmly. "I'm choosing a life where I'm valued as a person rather than as a commodity." "Marcus Blackwood will not stand for this," Jeremiah warned. "He has the power to destroy us all." "Then that's something you'll have to deal with," Elizabeth replied. "But it will be your problem to solve, not mine." James stepped forward and offered Elizabeth his arm. "If you're sure about this decision," he said quietly, "we should probably leave before things get more complicated." Elizabeth looked one last time at her mother, seeing the mixture of fear and pride in Ruth's eyes. "Mama," she said softly, "I hope someday you'll understand why I had to make this choice." Ruth nodded through her tears. "I understand now, daughter. I just wish I'd had your courage when I was your age." As James and Elizabeth prepared to leave, Jeremiah made one final, desperate attempt to maintain control. "If you walk out that door, you are no longer my daughter," he declared. "Don't expect to inherit anything from this family or to be welcomed back when your romantic notions prove to be foolish dreams." Elizabeth paused at the threshold and looked back at the man who had raised her, seeing him clearly for perhaps the first time. "Goodbye, Father," she said with quiet dignity. "I hope someday you'll realize that love and respect can't be beaten into people. They have to be earned." With those words, she walked out of her childhood home and into an uncertain but hopeful future, supported by a man who had proven himself willing to risk everything to defend what was right. The news of Elizabeth Morrison's dramatic escape from an arranged marriage and subsequent engagement to James Crawford spread through Cedar Ridge like wildfire. Within hours of their departure from the Morrison house, every resident of the small town was buzzing with speculation, gossip, and strong opinions about the unprecedented events that had unfolded. James had taken Elizabeth directly to the town doctor, Dr. Samuel Hartwell, to have her injuries properly treated. Dr. Hartwell was a kind, elderly man who had delivered half the Bobbies in Cedar Ridge and had seen enough of life to be shocked by very little. However, even he was appalled by the extent of Elizabeth's injuries. "Good Lord, girl," he muttered as he carefully cleaned the wounds on her back. "What kind of animal would do this to his own daughter?" Elizabeth remained silent during the examination, partly from physical pain and partly from emotional exhaustion. The enormity of what had happened and the decision she had made was beginning to sink in, and she felt overwhelmed by the rapid changes her life was undergoing. James waited anxiously in the doctor's outer office, packing the small space like a caged animal. He had acted on pure instinct when he made his proposal, driven by a combination of outrage at Elizabeth's treatment and a deep attraction to her that he had harbored for years. Now, in the cold light of reality, he was beginning to fully comprehend the magnitude of what they had both committed to. "She'll be fine physically," Dr. Hartwell announced when he emerged from the examination room. "The wounds are painful but not deep enough to cause permanent damage. However, she's going to need time to heal, both physically and emotionally. What happened to her today will leave scars that go far deeper than the ones on her back." James nodded grimly. "What can I do to help her?" Dr. Hartwell studied the young rancher with shrewd eyes. "You can be patient with her. She's been through a tremendous trauma, and trust doesn't come easily after something like that. You can also be prepared for the fact that there are going to be people in this town who will make life difficult for both of you." As if summoned by the doctor's words, the office door burst open and Marcus Blackwood strode in, his face flushed with anger and his eyes blazing with fury. Behind him stood two of his father's hired hands, large men who were clearly there to provide intimidation rather than conversation. "Where is she?" Marcus demanded without preamble. "Where is my intended bride?" James stepped protectively in front of the examination room door. "Miss Morrison is receiving medical treatment, and she's no longer your intended anything." Marcus's face contorted with rage. "That little witch belongs to me. Her father and I have a contract, and I intend to see it honored." "Elizabeth doesn't belong to anyone," James replied calmly, though his hands clenched into fists at his sides. "She's a human being with the right to make her own choices, and she's chosen not to marry you." "She's chosen nothing," Marcus snarled. "She's been manipulated by a fortune-hunting nobody who thinks he can steal what belongs to me." Dr. Hartwell stepped between the two men, his medical bag clutched protectively in his hands. "Gentlemen, this is a place of healing, not a saloon. I'll ask you to take your disputes elsewhere." "This isn't a dispute, Doctor," Marcus said, his voice dripping with menace. "This is theft, pure and simple. Crawford has stolen my property, and I intend to reclaim it." The examination room door opened at that moment, and Elizabeth emerged, moving carefully but with her head held high. She had changed into a clean dress that Dr. Hartwell's wife had provided, and though her face was pale with pain, her eyes burned with determination. "I am not your property, Marcus Blackwood," she said, her voice clear and strong despite everything she had endured. "I never was, and I never will be." Marcus's expression shifted from anger to what he probably believed was charm, but which came across as predatory. Elizabeth, darling, you've obviously been through a terrible ordeal. You're not thinking clearly. Come with me now, and we'll forget this unpleasantness ever happened. The only unpleasantness I want to forget is every moment I've had to spend in your presence, Elizabeth replied coldly. I've made my choice, and it has nothing to do with you. Marcus's facade of civility cracked completely. You think you're too good for me. You're nothing but a shopkeeper's daughter with delusions of grandeur. I could have given you everything, wealth, status, security, and you're throwing it all away for what? A dirt farmer who can barely keep his own ranch running. James stepped forward, his patience finally exhausted. That's enough. You've been told that Elizabeth isn't interested in your proposal. A gentleman would accept that decision gracefully. A gentleman, Marcus laughed harshly. You wouldn't know the first thing about being a gentleman, Crawford. You're nothing but a peasant who got lucky enough to scrape together enough money to buy some worthless land. At least I earned what I have through honest work, James replied evenly. I didn't inherit it or steal it from people who were too weak to fight back. The insult hit its mark, and Marcus's face turned an alarming shade of red. How dare you? How dare I what? James interrupted. How dare I tell the truth? Everyone in this county knows how your family acquired their wealth. Everyone knows about the homesteaders who mysteriously lost their land when they couldn't pay the debts they suddenly owed to your father's bank. Dr. Hartwell cleared his throat loudly. Gentlemen, I really must insist that you take this conversation outside. I have other patients to attend to. Marcus looked around the small office, taking in the doctor's disapproving expression, James's protective stance, and Elizabeth's unwavering resolve. He realized that he wasn't going to accomplish anything through direct confrontation, but his pride demanded that he have the last word. This isn't over, he said, his voice low and threatening. Elizabeth, when you come to your senses and realize what a mistake you've made, don't expect me to be waiting. And Crawford, you've made an enemy today that you can't afford to have. With that, he stormed out of the office, his hired hands trailing behind him like loyal attack dogs. The silence he left behind was heavy with unspoken fears about what kind of retaliation he might attempt. Dr. Hartwell shook his head sadly. That young man has always been trouble, but this situation has brought out the worst in him. You two need to be very careful. James nodded grimly. We will be. Thank you for taking care of Elizabeth, Doctor. Where will you go now? Dr. Hartwell asked. You can't go back to the Morrison house, and I suspect Marcus will be watching your ranch. James had been wondering the same thing. His small ranch house was isolated and vulnerable, making it an easy target for anyone seeking revenge. They needed somewhere safe to stay while they figured out their next steps. Pastor Williams might be able to help, Elizabeth suggested quietly. He's always been kind to me, and he's one of the few people in town who isn't afraid of the Blackwood family. James considered this option. Pastor Williams was indeed a good man who took his Christian duty seriously, but asking him to harbor them might put the elderly minister in danger as well. "We could ask," he said finally, "but I won't let anyone else get hurt because of our situation." They made their way through the darkening streets of Cedar Ridge, staying to the shadows and avoiding the main thoroughfares where they might be easily spotted. The town that had been Elizabeth's home for her entire life suddenly felt hostile and dangerous, full of eyes that watched from behind curtains and whispered conversations that stopped when they passed. Pastor Williams lived in a small house adjacent to the town's only church, a modest wooden structure that had served the community's spiritual needs for over 2 decades. When James knocked on the door, it was answered by the pastor's wife, Mrs. Williams, a plump, motherly woman who had always treated Elizabeth with kindness. "Elizabeth, dear," she exclaimed, immediately noticing the young woman's pale complexion and careful movements. "What's happened to you?" "It's a long story, Mrs. Williams," Elizabeth replied wearily. "Is Pastor Williams available? We need his help." Mrs. Williams ushered them inside without hesitation, her maternal instincts overriding any concerns about the unusual circumstances. Pastor Williams emerged from his study, a tall, thin man with kind eyes and graying hair that he was constantly pushing back from his forehead. "Elizabeth James," he said, his voice filled with concern. "I've been hearing disturbing rumors about events at the Morrison house today. Are you both all right?" Over the next hour, James and Elizabeth recounted the day's events, with Pastor Williams listening intently and asking occasional clarifying questions. His expression grew increasingly grave as he heard about Jeremiah's brutal treatment of his daughter and Marcus's threatening behavior. "I'm ashamed to say that I've suspected for some time that things weren't right in the Morrison household," Pastor Williams admitted. "But I never imagined it had reached this level of violence. We need somewhere safe to stay while we figure out what to do next," James explained. "I know it's asking a lot, but—" "Nonsense," Mrs. Williams interrupted firmly. "Of course you'll stay here. We have a spare room, and Elizabeth clearly needs time to recover from her ordeal." Pastor Williams nodded in agreement. "Martha's right. You're both welcome here for as long as you need. But I have to warn you that this situation is going to get worse before it gets better. The Blackwood family doesn't take public humiliation lightly, and Marcus is going to want revenge." "What kind of revenge?" Elizabeth asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. "Economic pressure, most likely," Pastor Williams replied. "The Blackwoods have their fingers in most of the business dealings in this county. They could make it very difficult for James to sell his cattle or obtain credit for ranch operations. They might also try to turn public opinion against you both. James had been expecting something like this, but hearing it confirmed still sent a chill down his spine. He had built his ranch from nothing through years of backbreaking work, and the thought of losing it all because he had done the right thing was deeply troubling. "There's something else," Pastor Williams continued reluctantly. "I've heard rumors that Marcus has been talking to some of the rougher elements in the county, men who wouldn't hesitate to use violence to settle disputes. You need to be very careful about your safety." Elizabeth felt a surge of guilt at the realization that her decision to escape an unwanted marriage was putting James in serious danger. "Maybe I should reconsider," she said quietly. "I don't want you to lose everything because of me." James turned to her with an expression of such fierce determination that it took her breath away. "Elizabeth Morrison, don't you dare even think about sacrificing yourself to protect me. I knew the risks when I made my proposal, and I'd make the same choice again without hesitation." "But your ranch is just land and buildings," James interrupted. "It can be rebuilt if necessary. But if you go back to that life, if you let them break your spirit, that damage can't be undone. You're worth more than any material possession I might lose." Elizabeth stared at him in wonder, struggling to process the depth of commitment he was showing to someone he barely knew. She had never experienced anything like the protective devotion he was displaying, and it both thrilled and terrified her. Pastor Williams watched this exchange with growing understanding of the dynamic between these two young people. What had started as a rescue, motivated by moral outrage, was clearly evolving into something much deeper and more complex. "There might be another option," he said thoughtfully. "I have a brother who pastors a church in Austin. It's a bigger city where you could start fresh without the baggage of this situation. If you were to marry quickly and quietly, before Marcus can organize any serious retaliation, you could leave Cedar Ridge as husband and wife and build a new life somewhere else." James and Elizabeth looked at each other, both recognizing the wisdom in Pastor Williams's suggestion, while also feeling overwhelmed by how quickly their relationship was being forced to evolve. "You're talking about a marriage of convenience," Elizabeth said slowly. "An arrangement to solve practical problems rather than a union based on love and genuine commitment. I'm talking about a marriage that starts with respect and shared values," Pastor Williams corrected gently. "Love can grow from that foundation, given time and nurturing. I've seen many successful marriages that began with less promising circumstances." James reached for Elizabeth's hand, covering her smaller fingers with his calloused palm. "The choice is yours," he said quietly. "I meant what I said when I proposed. I'd be honored to have you as my wife under any circumstances, but I won't pressure you into anything you're not ready for." Elizabeth looked down at their joined hands, marveling at how safe and protected she felt despite all the chaos surrounding them. Less than 12 hours ago, she had been facing a future that seemed hopeless and terrifying. Now she was being offered a chance at something completely different, a partnership with a man who had already proven his willingness to sacrifice for her well-being. "If we do this," she said carefully, "I want us to be completely honest with each other about our expectations and feelings. I won't pretend to be in love with you when I'm not, and I won't expect you to pretend romantic feelings you don't have." James smiled at her practical approach to what most people would consider a romantic decision. "I can live with honesty. In fact, I'd prefer it to false sentiments. And I want to contribute to our partnership in meaningful ways," Elizabeth continued. "I'm not looking for someone to take care of me. I'm looking for someone to build a life with." "That's exactly what I'm hoping for too," James assured her. Pastor Williams cleared his throat softly. "If you're both certain about this decision, I can perform the ceremony tomorrow morning. The sooner you're legally married, the stronger your position will be if Marcus tries to challenge your right to be together." Elizabeth took a deep breath, knowing that her next words would determine the entire course of her future. "Then let's do it. Let's get married tomorrow." The simplicity of the statement belied the magnitude of the decision. But sometimes the most life-changing moments came disguised as practical solutions to immediate problems. What none of them could predict was how this marriage of convenience would evolve into something none of them had anticipated. The wedding of Elizabeth Morrison and James Crawford took place at dawn on a crisp October morning, with only Pastor Williams, his wife Martha, and Dr. Hartwell as witnesses. The ceremony was held in the small church where Elizabeth had attended services her entire life, but the circumstances could not have been more different from the elaborate wedding she had once dreamed of as a young girl. Elizabeth wore a simple blue dress that Mrs. Williams had altered to fit her, while James wore his best suit, which showed the careful mending that spoke of a man who took care of his possessions but couldn't afford to replace them frequently. There were no flowers, no music, and no family present to celebrate the union, just two people making a solemn commitment to face an uncertain future together. "Do you, James Crawford, take Elizabeth Morrison to be your lawfully wedded wife, to have and to hold in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, for better or worse, till death do you part?" Pastor Williams intoned, his voice carrying the weight of decades of experience in joining couples together. "I do," James replied, his voice steady and sure as he looked directly into Elizabeth's eyes. "And do you, Elizabeth Morrison, take James Crawford to be your lawfully wedded husband, to have and to hold in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, for better or worse, till death do you part. Elizabeth hesitated for just a moment, not from doubt, but from the overwhelming realization that she was about to become a completely different person from the one she had been just 2 days ago. Then she looked at James's patient, understanding face and felt a sense of rightness settle over her. "I do," she said clearly. "Then by the power vested in me by the state of Texas and Almighty God, I now pronounce you husband and wife. James, you may kiss your bride." The kiss was brief and gentle, more of a formal seal on their agreement than a passionate expression of love. But there was something in the careful way James's lips touched hers that spoke of respect and promise, and Elizabeth found herself surprisingly moved by the simple gesture. "Congratulations, Mr. and Mrs. Crawford," Dr. Hartwell said warmly, shaking James's hand and giving Elizabeth a careful hug that avoided her still healing injuries. "I wish you both every happiness." Mrs. Williams dabbed at her eyes with her handkerchief. "It's not the wedding you probably dreamed of, dear," she said to Elizabeth, "but sometimes the most important ceremonies are the simple ones." As they signed the marriage certificate, Elizabeth couldn't help but notice that her father's signature was notably absent from the document. In most families, the bride's father would have been required to give his consent to the marriage, but given the circumstances, Pastor Williams had waived that requirement. It was another reminder of how completely she had severed ties with her old life. "What happens now?" Elizabeth asked as they prepared to leave the church. "Now we go home," James replied, then caught himself. "I mean, we go to the ranch. You're home now if you want it to be." The ride to James's ranch took them through some of the most beautiful countryside in Texas, with rolling hills covered in autumn grass and scattered oak trees that were just beginning to turn color. Elizabeth had never been this far from town before, and she found herself fascinated by the vastness of the landscape and the sense of freedom it represented. James's ranch was modest but well-maintained, with a small wooden house, a barn, and several outbuildings arranged around a central yard. The house itself was simple but sturdy, with a wide front porch and windows that looked out over the surrounding pastures where cattle grazed peacefully. "It's not much," James said somewhat apologetically as he helped Elizabeth down from the wagon, "but it's all mine, well, ours now, and there's room to grow if we work hard and get a little luck." Elizabeth walked slowly around the property, taking in the neat fences, the well-tended vegetable garden, and the general sense of pride and care that was evident in every detail. "It's beautiful," she said sincerely. "I can see how much love you've put into this place." James felt a warmth spread through his chest at her words. He had built this ranch with his own hands, working from dawn to dusk for years to create something that was truly his own. Having Elizabeth appreciate what he had accomplished meant more to him than he could express. The house was sparsely furnished but clean and comfortable, with a main room that served as both kitchen and living area, two bedrooms, and a small study that James used for keeping his ranch records. Elizabeth noticed immediately that everything was arranged with military precision, a habit that spoke of a man who lived alone and had learned to be completely self-sufficient. "You can have the larger bedroom," James said, carrying Elizabeth's few belongings inside. "I'll take the smaller one." Elizabeth looked at him in surprise. "We're married now, James. Shouldn't we be sharing a bedroom?" James paused in the doorway, his expression serious. "Elizabeth, I want you to know that I don't expect anything from you just because we're legally married. This arrangement is going to work only if we both feel comfortable and respected. If and when you want to share a bedroom, it will be because you choose to, not because you feel obligated." Elizabeth felt a rush of gratitude for his thoughtfulness, but also a twinge of something else, disappointment, perhaps, or loneliness. The idea of sharing a bedroom with James didn't frighten her the way the thought of being intimate with Marcus Blackwood had. There was something about James's quiet strength and genuine respect for her that made her feel safe in a way she had never experienced before. "What if I want to choose now?" she asked quietly. James stopped and turned to face her fully, studying her expression to make sure she was serious. "Are you certain? You've been through a tremendous trauma, and you might not be thinking clearly about what you want." Elizabeth appreciated his concern, but she also recognized that her feelings were more complex than simple gratitude or the desire for protection. There was something about James Crawford that drew her to him, his integrity, his quiet confidence, and the way he had risked everything to defend her when she needed it most. "I'm certain," she said, meeting his gaze directly. "I want to try to build a real marriage with you, James. Not just a legal arrangement, but a true partnership in every sense of the word." James felt his heart begin to race as he realized that Elizabeth was offering him something he had never dared to hope for: the possibility of a real relationship with the woman he had admired from afar for so long. "Then we'll share the larger bedroom," he said simply. "But we'll take things slowly, at whatever pace feels right for both of us." As they settled into their new life together, both James and Elizabeth discovered that they had more in common than either had expected. Elizabeth threw herself into learning about ranch operations with the same enthusiasm she had once applied to her studies, while James found himself opening up to another person in ways he had never thought possible. The physical intimacy between them developed gradually and naturally, growing out of genuine affection and mutual respect rather than duty or obligation. Elizabeth discovered that James was as gentle and considerate a lover as he was a husband, always attentive to her comfort and pleasure. For his part, James found that Elizabeth's intelligence and passion extended to every aspect of their relationship, making their physical connection as mentally stimulating as it was emotionally satisfying. But their happiness was not destined to remain undisturbed. As Pastor Williams had predicted, Marcus Blackwood was not the type of man to accept defeat gracefully, and he had been spending the weeks since their marriage planning his revenge. The first sign of trouble came when James tried to sell a herd of cattle at the regional market. Buyers who had dealt with him fairly for years suddenly found reasons to offer prices far below market value, or claimed they had no need for cattle at all. It didn't take long for James to realize that word had been spread about his unreliability as a business partner. "It's Marcus," Elizabeth said when James returned home frustrated after another failed attempt to sell his livestock. "He's using his family's influence to cut off our income." James nodded grimly. "I expected something like this, but I hoped it would take longer to organize. We're going to have to find new markets, probably in other counties where the Blackwood name doesn't carry as much weight." The economic pressure was concerning, but it was the escalating threats of violence that truly worried both of them. Strange men had been seen riding the boundaries of their property, and several of their neighbors had reported unusual activity in the area. Dr. Hartwell had even stopped by to warn them that Marcus had been asking questions about their daily routines and movements. "Maybe we should consider Pastor Williams's suggestion about moving to Austin," Elizabeth said one evening as they sat on their front porch, watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant shades of orange and pink. James was quiet for a long moment, torn between his love for the ranch he had built and his determination to keep Elizabeth safe. "If that's what you want," he said finally, "we can start making arrangements." Elizabeth reached for his hand, intertwining their fingers as she had grown accustomed to doing. "What I want is for us to be safe and happy together. If we can have that here, wonderful. If we need to go somewhere else to find it, then that's what we'll do." James squeezed her hand gently, marveling at how much his life had changed in such a short time. A few months ago, he had been a lonely bachelor whose greatest ambition was to expand his small ranch. Now he was a married man with a partner who shared his dreams and was willing to face any challenge alongside him. "Let's give it a little more time," he decided. "But if things get any worse, we'll head to Austin and start fresh." Neither of them realized that Marcus Blackwood had already decided that economic pressure and intimidation weren't sufficient to satisfy his wounded pride. The final confrontation was coming, and it would test everything they had built together. The attack came on a moonless night in late November, when the darkness provided perfect cover for the 6 armed men who surrounded the Crawford Ranch house. James and Elizabeth were awakened by the sound of horses and harsh voices, and James immediately reached for the rifle he kept beside the bed. "Stay down," he whispered to Elizabeth as he moved toward the window to assess the situation. What he saw made his blood run cold. Men with bandanas covering their faces, all carrying weapons and clearly intent on violence. "Crawford," Marcus Blackwood's voice called out from the darkness. "Come out here and face me like a man." James checked his rifle and moved toward the front door, his mind racing as he tried to figure out how to protect Elizabeth while dealing with multiple armed attackers. He had been in similar situations during his time in the army, but never with someone he loved depending on him for protection. "What do you want, Blackwood?" James called back, not bothering to open the door. "I want what belongs to me," Marcus replied. "Send Elizabeth out, and maybe the rest of this doesn't have to get ugly." "She's my wife now," James responded firmly. "She doesn't belong to you or anyone else." Marcus's laughter was harsh and bitter. "Your wife? You think a piece of paper changes anything? She was promised to me, and I intend to collect what's mine." Elizabeth appeared beside James, carrying the shotgun from the kitchen. Her face was pale but determined, and James could see that she was prepared to fight for their life together. "I'm not going anywhere with you, Marcus," she called out, her voice carrying clearly in the still night air. "Find yourself another victim for your cruelty." "There's 6 of us and 2 of you," Marcus replied. "This can end easy or hard, but it's going to end with Elizabeth coming with me." James and Elizabeth exchanged a look that conveyed everything they needed to communicate. They both knew that Marcus had no intention of letting James live, regardless of whether Elizabeth cooperated or not. This was a fight to the death, and their only chance was to make it as costly as possible for their attackers. "Elizabeth," James said quietly, "when I give the signal, I want you to go out the back door and run for the tree line. Don't look back, no matter what happens." "I'm not leaving you," Elizabeth replied firmly. "We face this together." Before James could argue, the sound of breaking glass told them that their enemies were done talking. The final battle for their future had begun, and only one side would survive to see the dawn. The crash of shattering glass from the kitchen window galvanized both James and Elizabeth into action. James positioned himself at the front window while Elizabeth covered the back of the house, both of them knowing that their survival depended on making every shot count. "They're trying to flush us out by setting fire to the barn," Elizabeth reported, seeing the orange glow beginning to flicker against the night sky. "If the wind picks up, it could spread to the house." James cursed under his breath. Marcus was proving to be more tactical than he had expected, using the threat of fire to force them into the open where his superior numbers would be decisive. They needed help, and they needed it fast. As if summoned by their desperate thoughts, the sound of approaching horses came from the direction of town. James peered cautiously out the front window and felt his heart leap with hope as he recognized Pastor Williams, Dr. Hartwell, and several other men from Cedar Ridge riding hard toward the ranch. "Looks like we've got company, Blackwood," James called out, his voice filled with renewed confidence. Marcus's response was a string of profanity that would have made a sailor blush, followed by frantic orders to his men to finish the job quickly before the reinforcements could arrive. The battle that followed was brief but intense. James and Elizabeth fought with the desperation of people who had everything to lose, while their attackers quickly discovered that intimidating unarmed townspeople was very different from facing determined opponents who were fighting for their lives. When the shooting stopped, two of Marcus's hired guns lay dead in the ranch yard, while Marcus himself had taken a bullet in the shoulder from Elizabeth's well-aimed shotgun blast. The remaining attackers had fled into the darkness, leaving their wounded leader to face the consequences of his actions. Pastor Williams and Dr. Hartwell were the first to reach the house, both men visibly relieved to find James and Elizabeth alive and unharmed. Behind them came Sheriff Thompson, who had been reluctant to challenge the Blackwood family's influence, but could no longer ignore the blatant criminality of Marcus's actions. "Marcus Blackwood," Sheriff Thompson announced formally, "you're under arrest for attempted murder, arson, and conspiracy to commit violence." Marcus, his face twisted with pain and rage, glared at Elizabeth with undisguised hatred. "This isn't over," he snarled. "My family has enough money and influence to make sure I never see the inside of a jail cell." "Your family's influence has its limits," Dr. Hartwell replied quietly, "especially when there are witnesses to attempted murder and a barn full of evidence showing premeditation." As Marcus was led away in shackles, James and Elizabeth stood together on their front porch, watching the flames consume the barn that represented months of hard work and investment. But instead of despair, they felt a strange sense of triumph. "We did it," Elizabeth said softly, leaning against James's shoulder. "We actually survived." James wrapped his arms around his wife, still hardly able to believe that they had come through such a dangerous situation relatively unscathed. "We did more than survive," he replied. "We proved that we can face anything together." Pastor Williams approached them with a concerned expression. "The barn can be rebuilt," he said, "but I'm worried about what happens next. The Blackwood family isn't going to simply accept Marcus's arrest and imprisonment." James nodded, having already considered this possibility. "Then maybe it is time to consider that fresh start in Austin," he said to Elizabeth. "We can sell the ranch and use the money to start over somewhere else." Elizabeth looked around at the property that had become her home, taking in the house where she had discovered what it meant to be truly loved and respected, the pastures where she had learned to ride and work cattle, and the vegetable garden where she had planted seeds for their future together. Or, she said thoughtfully, we could stay and fight for what's ours. This ranch represents everything we've built together, James. I don't want to let anyone drive us away from it. James studied his wife's determined face, seeing in her expression the same fierce courage that had first attracted him to her. It won't be easy, he warned. Even with Marcus in jail, his family will keep trying to destroy us. Then we'll have to be stronger than they are, Elizabeth replied. We'll have to build alliances with people who believe in justice and fair play. We'll have to prove that ordinary people can stand up to bullies and win. Dr. Hartwell smiled at her words. You know, Elizabeth, I think you might be exactly what this community needs. Someone who's not afraid to challenge the established order when it's wrong. Over the following months, James and Elizabeth did exactly what Elizabeth had suggested. They rebuilt their barn with the help of neighbors who had been inspired by their courage to stand up to the Blackwood family's intimidation. They diversified their ranch operations to include crops and dairy production, reducing their dependence on cattle sales that could be manipulated by their enemies. Most importantly, they built a network of relationships with other small ranchers and farmers who had been struggling under the economic pressure applied by the larger landowners. Elizabeth used her intelligence and education to help organize cooperative buying and selling arrangements that gave the smaller operators more power in the marketplace. Marcus Blackwood was eventually convicted of attempted murder and sentenced to 10 years in prison, a verdict that sent shockwaves through the established power structure of the county. His father, Nathan Blackwood, initially tried to use his influence to have the conviction overturned, but the evidence was too overwhelming and the public sentiment too strongly against the family. James and Elizabeth's marriage, which had begun as a practical solution to an immediate crisis, evolved into something beautiful and profound. They discovered that shared adversity had forged a bond between them that was stronger than romantic love alone could have created. They were partners in the truest sense of the word, facing every challenge together and celebrating every victory as a team. 5 years after their dramatic wedding, Elizabeth gave birth to their first child, a daughter they named Hope. As James held his newborn daughter for the first time, he reflected on how completely his life had changed since that October day when he had witnessed Elizabeth's courage in the face of impossible odds. She's going to grow up in a world where she can make her own choices, Elizabeth said softly, watching her husband's face as he marveled at their daughter's tiny fingers and perfect features. She's going to grow up knowing that her parents fought for the right to live their lives on their own terms, James replied. And she's going to know that sometimes the most important thing you can do is stand up for what's right, even when it's dangerous. Elizabeth smiled, thinking about the journey that had brought them to this moment. What had started as a desperate escape from an impossible situation had become the foundation for a life filled with purpose, meaning, and genuine happiness. The Crawford Ranch became a symbol of hope for others who faced similar struggles against powerful oppressors. People from across the county came to seek James and Elizabeth advice on everything from cooperative farming techniques to legal strategies for challenging unfair business practices. Elizabeth, in particular, became known as someone who could help women trapped in abusive situations find the courage and resources to escape. She never forgot what it felt like to face a future that seemed hopeless, and she was determined to help others discover that there were always alternatives to accepting unacceptable circumstances. As the years passed, the story of Elizabeth Morrison's dramatic escape from an arranged marriage and her subsequent fight to build a life of dignity and purpose became the stuff of local legend. But for James and Elizabeth themselves, it was simply the beginning of a love story that proved that sometimes the most lasting relationships are built on a foundation of mutual respect, shared values, and the courage to stand up for what's right. Their marriage had begun with a desperate proposal made in the heat of crisis, but it had evolved into something that neither of them could have imagined. A partnership that made both of them stronger, braver, and more capable of facing whatever challenges life might bring. In the end, they had done more than just survive the attempts to destroy them. They had thrived, building not only a successful ranch, but also a legacy of courage and integrity that would inspire others for generations to come. And it all started with a young woman's refusal to accept a future that someone else had chosen for her, and a man's willingness to risk everything to defend her right to choose her own path.